What would it be like to host one of the most influential and popular podcasts on the planet? Well, you're in luck. I was fortunate enough to sit down and have this really deep and insightful conversation with one such individual. And who I'm referring to here is Latif Nasser, the co-host of Radiolab. I'm Christopher Schoenwald, podcaster, entrepreneur, educator, coming at you from the land of the rising sun, Japan. Yeah, Latif Nasser. The guy doesn't need a whole lot of an introduction. You know him, WNYC Studios Radiolab. Beyond that, he's the host of the Netflix docuseries Connected. And we had this really deep and insightful conversation about a lot of things, in terms of how he got started in his career and how he landed his dream job of getting onto Radiolab, which I think, by the way, is really insightful and will help anyone who's kind of looking to find their dream job, and not only find it, but land it. So that's one thing. Beyond that, we also get into a lot of other things related to, the roles and responsibilities, how he comes up with such great content. And that's one of the things with Latif. He's famous, world famous, for coming up with these really great stories that just resonate with people. How does he do it? Well, he kind of breaks that down for us in this conversation. We also look towards the future, where things are going within the world of podcasting, and what opportunities lie for people who are looking to get into it all. So this conversation here, it's just the highlights. It's the highlights of the full talk, which, by the way, you can find wherever you access your podcast. Just search for Life as a ... All right, well, why don't we get into this conversation? All right, first up, let's hear about how Latif landed the job at Radiolab.
When I was graduating from grad school, and I was just like, "Oh, journalism! This seems like a cool thing." Then I heard this show Radiolab. I kind of fell in love with it, and I sort of started pitching them stories. I started like haunting their offices. Like they would at some point I was pitching so many stories that they were like, "Oh, why don't you just come to the pitch meeting anyway? You can just explain your stories that you're pitching better because you're pitching every week anyway." Anyway, so at some point I was sort of haunting those offices, and then at some point they were like, "Okay, I guess we just oh, you don't already work here? Like, okay, we're just gonna hire you."
Yeah, so how do you not love that? As cliche as it sounds, persistence does kind of pay off, right? Well, let's dive into the inner workings of Radiolab. I was lucky enough to kind of get an inside look at, some of the roles and responsibilities that Latif does have. You might assume that it's just now the co-host and that's it. That's kind of what I thought too, but the way he kind of broke it down, there's a lot going on there. So yeah, check it out.
Radiolab, even though now it has way more people than it had when I started, but maybe it has 20 people or something. Okay. But even then, we're big for a podcast, but for a company, let's say, it's still fairly small in the sense that there are a lot of utility players. Everyone's kind of going around doing very specific things. And there are so many parts of the job, and there's certainly some people who are more specialized than others. But I do I'm the co-host, but I also I love writing web copy. I do that all the time. I'll book interviews sometimes. I'm, cutting select sometimes. I'm doing this sometimes. I'm doing that sometimes. There's a lot of parts to the job. And so co-host is definitely one part of it. Editor is one part of it. Booker is one part of it. Pre-interviewer is one part of it. Like pitcher is one part of it. So they're all, I don't know. It's kind of a stitched together.
All intertwined. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Now this next segment is coming from one of my favorite segments on Life as and you'll see how I set it up and what it's all about. But I also want you to kind of pay attention to Latif's reaction and what he shares, what his experiences are with it, because I think there's some of the true gems of the conversation come out within this clip.
Just how these pathways, they're never linear. They're never from A to B straight across a line. They're always there's zigging and zagging, and there's ups, there's downs. And it's really quite fascinating to see. And I think for guests as well, some of the comments I get afterwards is it's interesting for them to kind of look back, because you forget about all these little moments in these journey points along the way, and you can kind of see it and look back from afar and okay, that's how this connected to that. And really
for sure. And it's first of all, those, and I like to think of them in my life as they were left-hand turns. They were really, they were not straight ahead, right? They were not linear. And to me, the other thing that makes that even more remarkable, I guess, like so the two jobs that you mentioned that I have, it's like one is I co-host a podcast, and one is I was a host of a Netflix docuseries.
Yeah.
When I was graduating from college, neither of those two things existed.
There you go.
I had never heard of a podcast. Netflix
go.
was like mailing DVDs to people. Like neither of those things. I could never even have conceived of doing those things. Yeah. And so really so to me, like, even if I had charted a linear path, like I don't know. I don't even know if that job would still exist. And in the meantime, jobs that I did love and do feel like they speak to me so much more, like, opened up. So I don't know. I feel like that's not to say, I mean, there are people out there for whom they have a linear path, and that's great. And I hope they, stick to it. But for me, that, like, that's the way. That's the way that that feels most true.
Yeah, so that was inspirational, right? I think that really, really is helpful. And it's a good reminder for anyone especially who's just entering the workforce, who's trying to get a handle or an idea of where they're going to be. Well, you don't have to have it all figured out. All right, well, if you thought that was good, you have to check out this next clip, because this, again, is one of the true gems of this conversation.
Like, curiosity was definitely one of the things that drove me, but like, I think there's like a grab bag of skills that I feel like, or interests, let's say, that I had, that if you put them together, if you separate them out, they sound really disparate and kind of random. Like, I'm interested in theater and storytelling. I'm interested in science and the natural world. I'm interested in history and like how things became the way. So like, those three things are like kind of different. Yeah. But then to find a way to use those three things, and everybody has their own, constellation of different things, but then to use them to triangulate, to be like, oh, maybe I could, if there was a thing that existed that could combine this and this, but nobody's doing that. But actually that's good, because then I can walk into a place like Radiolab and I'll have pitches, that nobody else has, because they're not thinking about the history of science in a theatrical way or whatever it is, right? So to me, it's like that, like I think that you're so right. It's like finding the passion, or like, but it's also like finding those things that you really love, and then trying to triangulate based on those,
I hope you're taking notes right now, because the stuff that Latif is sharing is literally gold. It's oftentimes these fine distinctions between, what people do and what they don't do that really separates them into these different buckets, like people that are succeeding, people that are moderately successful, people that aren't really finding success. It's just a different way of sort of interpreting the world and approaching things in a unique manner. So yeah, and speaking of which, there's a bit more that I'd like to share.
And I think it's sort of one of the things that has allowed me to become a journalist. Like, I like to keep asking questions. I don't mind being or being perceived as, which are both true and important, the dumbest person in the room. That's okay. I feel good about that. I like that. That's the place I want to be, in a way, because it means I'm learning something,
All right, I'm going to show you one more clip from my conversation with Latif, and this one quite possibly is my absolute favorite. And I'm returning to that point and what I was saying of like what really kind of distinguishes people, how they think, how they interpret the world. Well, this is right down that alley, and yeah, you're going to kind of get an inside look at the way that Latif sort of views the world, and how he ultimately comes up with such great content that millions and millions of people around the world just devour.
There are about 8 billion people on planet Earth. Just presume 1% of them in any given week have something dynamic, interesting, newsworthy happen to them in any given week, right? Yeah. And then put together all the output of all the mainstream media outlets combined. Like, could they tell, like, I'm now missing the math here. What is it? Like 80 million, 8 million, whatever the number is, 800 million. Could they tell that many stories in a week? Like, no, it's impossible. And those are just alive people. There are also dead people and plants and animals and consumer goods and laws and planets and bugs and, like, just there's pop
Endless,
songs.
right?
There's a million. It's an infinity. There are an infinity of stories all around us, and like there's just this tiny fraction that we sort of just keep telling over and over and over again, and you forget that, like, oh, there's this whole, it's like the light spectrum or something. It's like we can only see this tiny fraction of it, and then we forget that there's all this other stuff out there. And so if you kind of can hack your filters in such a way that all of a sudden now, okay, I'm wearing special goggles that I can see ultraviolet rays, all of a sudden you're like, oh, there's stories everywhere. There are stories everywhere. And it's just a matter of framing. And once you have that framing, all of a sudden now the world is a giant scavenger hunt. It's like it's a fun game. How do I find stories that other people aren't telling or aren't paying attention to that they really ought to be?
I think it might be time to close out this video, but I do encourage you to listen to the full-length conversation, and you can do so wherever you access your podcast: Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, wherever that might be. Go check it out, lifeasa ... And while I do have your attention, big ask time. Please hit that like and subscribe button. And the reason I ask that is, YouTube itself and its algorithm, the only way that it knows that content matters is when people do that. And I have this feeling that, all this great wisdom that these guests continually week in and week out are serving up, it's a bit of a waste if it just kind of gets pushed off into the corner and nobody's seeing it. And again, the only way to remedy that is like and subscribe. So yeah, I could be biased here, but this content, I think it can set people up for success, not only for a week, for a month, but for years. So yeah, like and subscribe one last time. And yeah, please tune in to the next episode of Life as a, well, I'll have the next guest lined up so you can kind of evaluate whether or not that career or opportunity could be for you. All right, see you next time.